Hello, my name is Major Russ Guilfoyle. Today, we are going to cover the Code of Conduct. The Code of Conduct serves as a tool for surviving captivity with honor. All members of the armed forces are expected to meet the standards the Code of Conduct embodies. Although designed for evasion and prisoner of war situations, the spirit and intent of the Code of Conduct are applicable to service members subjected to other hostile detention, and such service members should conduct themselves consistently in a manner that avoids discrediting themselves and their country. First, we will cover the history of the Code of Conduct, then a few broad points, then we'll get into the 6 articles that make up the Code of Conduct. Finally, we'll cover some situational guidance for peacetime captivity, government detention, and terrorist captivity. During the Korean War in the early 1950s, Chinese and North Korean forces captured American military personnel as prisoners of war. Unlike America's previous wars against mostly Western Hemisphere adversaries in Europe and the Americas, these American prisoners faced a harsher POW environment. It was the first American war that U.S. prisoners of war were viewed by an enemy as more than soldiers from the other side, just temporarily restrained from conducting war. The POW camps sought to control the minds of the U.S. prisoners. North Korean and Chinese communists were not hesitant to use brutal and bloody torture as gruesome tools in their efforts to exploit U.S. prisoners of war into making public statements that appeared favorable to the communist war effort. For the American prisoners, brutal torture, lack of food, absence of medical aid, and subhuman treatment became a daily way of life, and many of them found that their training had not prepared them for this new battlefield. One of the most elaborate propaganda efforts was the 1952 POW Olympics, held in Pyeongtaek, North Korea. For 12 days in November, approximately 500 prisoner athletes from Britain, South Korea, Australia, Turkey, and the U.S. competed against other camps in events mirroring the World Olympics, such as baseball, boxing, and track and field. This effort was publicized to show the world just how well the UN prisoners were treated. Of course, this was not the reality. Very few American servicemen were mentally prepared to protect themselves from such barbaric treatment and intense indoctrination attempts. Through inhumane treatment and manipulation, many prisoners were forced to collaborate with the communists. After the termination of the hostilities in Korea and the subsequent release of American prisoners of war, 21 Americans chose to remain in China, refusing repatriation. Many former U.S. prisoners coming back to their homeland were criminally charged and tried for offenses that amounted to treason, desertion to the enemy, mistreatment of fellow prisoners of war, and similar crimes. The emotions and compassion of the public were aroused as graphic details of the inhumane treatment of U.S. POWs in communist prison camps surfaced during the trials. Public discussion caused intense arguments over what should have been done about Americans who were brainwashed in Korea, and what to do about those in future wars who may be the recipients of similar bloody treatment. So on August 7, 1954, Charles Irwin Wilson, the United States Secretary of Defense, directed that a committee be formed to recommend a suitable approach for conducting a comprehensive study of the problems related to the entire Korean War POW experience. While all services at the time had regulations governing the conduct of prisoners of war, the United States Armed Forces had never had a clearly defined code of conduct applicable to American prisoners after capture. Colonel Franklin Brooke Nehart, USMC, worked at Marine Corps headquarters throughout the summer of 1955, where he outlined his ideas in longhand, which was then adopted as a code of conduct with the issuance of Executive Order 10631 by President Dwight D. Eisenhower on 17 August 1955, which stated, in quote, "Every member of the armed forces of the United States are expected to measure up to the standards embodied in the Code of Conduct while in combat or in captivity," end quote. It has been modified twice, once in 1977 by President Jimmy Carter in Executive Order 12017 adding the bounce back policy, which we will cover, and most recently, President Ronald Reagan's Executive Order 12633 of March 1988, which changed the language from serviceman to American servant in the armed forces. A timely change as women became captives in Operation Desert Shield, Desert Storm only 2 years later. The Code of Conduct is not a punitive order. A soldier cannot be charged for violating the Code of Conduct. However, conduct that does not meet the spirit of the Code of Conduct could possibly be a violation of the UCMJ and thus be criminally charged. Examples would be Article 104, aiding the enemy, or Article 105, misconduct as a prisoner. Next, the Code of Conduct does not apply to civilians. However, they should be encouraged to attend training as the concepts are useful to anyone held in captivity. There are many historical examples of civilians captured in Vietnam who, along with their military peers, complied honorably with the Code of Conduct. And lastly, it is important to know that any time American service members are taken into captivity, the media labels them POWs. But this is not always an accurate label. To be a POW with all the protections of the Geneva Conventions, that military personnel must be engaged in an international armed conflict against another signatory nation to the conventions. Here are the primary references for the training today. Now let's begin learning the 6 articles that make up the Code of Conduct. Article 1. I am an American, fighting in the forces which guard my country and our way of life. I am prepared to give my life in their defense. Article 1 of the Code of Conduct applies to all service members at all times. A member of the armed forces has a duty to support U.S. interests and oppose enemies, regardless of the circumstances, whether located in a combat environment or in captivity. Medical personnel and chaplains are obligated to abide by most provisions of the Code of Conduct. However, their special retained status under the Geneva Conventions grants them some flexibility. Past experience of captured Americans reveals that honorable survival in captivity requires that a service member possess a high degree of dedication and motivation. Maintaining these qualities requires knowledge of and a strong belief in the advantages of American democratic institutions and concepts, love of and faith in the United States, a conviction that the U.S. cause is just, and faith in and loyalty to fellow POWs. Possessing the dedication and motivation of these beliefs and trust enables POWs to survive long and stressful periods of captivity and return to their country and families honorably. Article 2. I will never surrender of my own free will. If in command, I will never surrender the members of my command while they still have the means to resist. What does it mean to surrender? Surrender is the willful act of members of the armed forces turning themselves over to the enemy forces when not required by utmost necessity or extremity. Surrender is always dishonorable and never allowed. When there is no chance for meaningful resistance, evasion is impossible, and further fighting would lead to their death with no significant loss to the enemy. Members of the armed forces should view themselves as captured against their will versus a circumstance that is seen as voluntary surrendering. They must remember that the capture was dictated by the futility of the situation and overwhelming enemy strengths. In this case, capture is not dishonorable. Capture does not constitute a dishonorable act if the service member has exhausted all reasonable means of avoiding it, and the only alternative is death or serious bodily injury. A note on medical and religious personnel, like doctors, nurses, and chaplains. They may only resort to arms in self-defense or in defense of the wounded and sick in their charge when attacked in violation of the Geneva Convention. They must refrain from all aggressive action and may not use force to prevent their capture or that of their unit by the enemy. It is, on the other hand, perfectly legitimate for a medical unit to withdraw in the face of the enemy. Members of the armed forces may never surrender voluntarily. Even when isolated and no longer able to inflict casualties on the enemy or otherwise defend themselves, it is their duty to evade capture and rejoin the nearest friendly force. So if you are cut off, shot down, or otherwise isolated in enemy-controlled territory, you must make every effort to avoid capture. The courses of action available include concealment until recovered by friendly rescue forces, evasive travel to a friendly or neutral territory, and evasive travel to other pre-briefed areas. If the command is still functional, it is the commander's determination as to the point at which the unit is captured. Commanders, you are not captured while there is a reasonable power to resist, break out, or evade to rejoin friendly forces. Article 3. If I am captured, I will continue to resist by all means available. I will make every effort to escape and aid others to escape. I will accept neither parole nor special favors from the enemy. The misfortune of capture does not lessen the duty of a member of the armed forces to continue resisting enemy exploitation by all means necessary. Contrary to the Geneva Conventions, enemies whom U.S. forces have engaged since 1949 have regarded the POW compound as an extension of the battlefield and used a variety of tactics to exploit POWs for propaganda purposes or to obtain military information. The POW must be prepared for this fact and resist physical and mental harassment, general mistreatment, torture, medical neglect, and political indoctrination. The resistance the Code of Conduct requires is in accordance with the protections of the Geneva Conventions. Understand that resistance beyond that identified in the Code of Conduct subjects a POW to possible punishment by the captor for order and discipline violations, which may also be criminally prosecuted by the detaining powers laws or under the Geneva Convention. Furthermore, POWs may find themselves accused of being war criminals simply because they waged war against these countries before capture. The U.S. government and most other countries do not recognize the validity of this argument. The Geneva Conventions recognize that the regulations of a POW's country may impose the duty to escape, and that POWs may attempt to escape. Under the guidance and supervision of the senior military person and POW organization, POWs must be prepared to take advantage of escape opportunities whenever they arise. In communal detention, the welfare of the POWs who remain behind must be considered. A POW must think escape, must try to escape if able to do so, and must assist others to escape. Successful escape by a POW causes the enemy to divert forces that might otherwise be fighting, provides the United States valuable information about the enemy and other POWs in captivity, and serves as a positive example to all members of the armed forces. The advantage of early escape is that usually the POW is closer to friendly forces. The initial captors are usually not trained guards. The security system may be relatively lax, and that the POW is not yet in a debilitated physical condition. Begin escape planning at the earliest possible moment, and continuing escape planning throughout captivity even when no obvious escape opportunities exist. POWs should passively collect information on the captors, the strengths and weaknesses of the facility and its security personnel, the surrounding terrain and conditions that could affect an escape attempt, and items and materials within the camp that may support an escape effort. This alertness and continual planning for escape places a POW in the best position to exploit, facilitate, or provide assistance during an escape opportunity. Parole agreements are promises a POW gives the captor to fulfill stated conditions, such as not to bear arms or not to escape, in exchange for special privileges, such as release from captivity or lessened restraint. The United States does not authorize any military service member to sign or enter into any such parole agreement. The duty to escape or to actively aid others in escaping does not apply to personnel exclusively engaged in medical or religious duties. For example, doctors, nurses, and chaplains. They are called retained personnel, and, other than the duty to attempt or aid escape, must follow the Code of Conduct. If retained personnel are treated like POWs, then the duty to escape or to actively aid others in escaping arises again. Lastly, retained personnel must assert their rights as retained personnel to perform their medical and religious duties for the benefit of the POWs, and must take every opportunity to do so. Article 4. If I become a prisoner of war, I will keep faith in my fellow prisoners. I will give no information or take part in any action which might be harmful to my comrades. If I am senior, I will take command. I will obey the lawful orders of those appointed over me and will back them up in every way. A POW who voluntarily informs or collaborates with the captor is disloyal to the United States and fellow POWs, and after repatriation is subject to disciplinary action. The key word is voluntary. There is a significant difference between a collaborator who must be persuaded to return and a resistor who, only after having been physically or mentally tortured, complies with the captor's improper demands, such as to provide information or propaganda. The collaborator's conduct is reprehensible and cannot be sanctioned, whereas the resistor should be given help to gather strength and resume resistance. POWs especially must avoid helping the enemy to identify fellow POWs who may have knowledge of value to the enemy and who may be made to suffer coercive interrogation. An informer or collaborator should be insulated from sensitive information on POW organization, but members of the POW organization should continually encourage and try to persuade the collaborator to cease such activities. Know that welcoming a repentant collaborator back to the fold is generally a more effective POW organizational approach than continued isolation, which may encourage the collaborator to continue such disloyal conduct. Maintaining communications is one of the most important ways that POWs aid one another. Communication breaks down the barriers of isolation that an enemy may attempt to construct and helps strengthen a POW's will to resist. Each POW, immediately upon capture, shall try to make contact with fellow POWs by any means available, and thereafter shall continue to communicate and participate vigorously as part of the POW organization. Remember that faith, trust, and individual group loyalties have great value in strengthening fellow POWs. Lastly, be familiar with the major ethnic, to include racial demographics, cultural, and national characteristics of the enemy that may affect POW-captor relationships to the detriment of individual POWs and the POW organization. Wherever located, POWs should organize in a military manner under the senior military POW, officer, or enlisted, without regard to branch of service. That POW shall assume command and cannot evade that responsibility and accountability. Strong leadership is essential to discipline. Without discipline, camp organization, resistance, and even survival may be impossible. Personal hygiene, camp sanitation, and care of the sick and wounded are imperative. When taking command, the senior POW shall inform the other POWs and shall designate the chain of command. If the senior POW is incapacitated or is otherwise unable to act for any reason, the next senior POW shall assume command. Officers and non-commissioned officers shall continue to carry out their responsibilities and exercise their authority in captivity. Know that sometimes the chain of command must be covert and kept secret from the enemy. Other times it is overt and known by the enemy. The chosen strategy is situationally dependent. The enemy or the POWs themselves may elect a prisoner's representative that is the primary liaison between the POWs and the captors. The prisoner's representative is a representative of the command and has no command authority themselves, despite what the enemy might say to divide the organization. The responsibility of subordinates to obey the lawful orders of ranking American military personnel remains unchanged. Failure to do so shall result in the weakening of organization, a lowering of resistance, and, after repatriation, may result in legal proceedings under the UCMJ. Know that in situations where military and civilian personnel are imprisoned together, the senior military POW should make every effort to persuade civilian prisoners that the military service members assuming overall command leadership of the entire prisoner group, based upon experience and specific training, is advantageous to the entire prisoner community. Lastly, note who cannot command. Medical personnel shall not assume command over non-medical personnel, and chaplains shall not assume command over military personnel of any branch. Article 5. When questioned, should I become a POW, I am required to give my name, rank, service number, and date of birth. I will evade answering any further questions to the utmost of my ability. I will make no oral or written statements disloyal to my country and its allies or harmful to their cause. When questioned, a POW is required by the Geneva Conventions and the Code of Conduct, and is permitted by the UCMJ to give name, rank, service number, and date of birth. Under the Geneva Conventions, the enemy has no right to try to force a POW to provide any additional information. However, it is unrealistic to expect a POW to remain confined for years, reciting only name, rank, service number, and date of birth. There are many POW camp situations in which certain types of conversations with the enemy are permitted. For example, a POW is allowed to communicate with captors on matters of camp administration and health and welfare. POWs can also write letters home and fill out a Geneva Conventions capture card, though must exercise great caution to resist, avoid, or evade all enemy efforts to secure statements or actions that may further the enemy's cause. Avoid giving oral or written confessions, making propaganda, broadcast appeals to other POWs to comply with improper demands, avoid appealing to U.S. surrender or parole, or engaging in self-criticisms. The POW experience has shown that although enemy interrogation sessions may be harsh and cruel, it is usually possible to resist, if there is a will to resist. Fortify your will by keeping faith with the United States, fellow POWs, and oneself. Know common resistance techniques, such as claiming inability to furnish additional information because of previous orders, poor memory, ignorance, or lack of comprehension, and become familiar with the various aspects of the interrogation process, its phases and procedures, methods and techniques of interrogation, the interrogator's goals, strengths, and weaknesses, and the captor's reasons for and methods of attempting to involve POWs in both internal and external propaganda activities. Short of death, it is unlikely that a POW may prevent a skilled enemy interrogator using all available psychological and physical methods of coercion from obtaining some degree of compliance by the POW with captor demands. If the interrogator takes the service member past the point of maximum endurance, the POW must recover or bounce back as quickly as possible and resist each successive captor exploitation effort to the utmost. Captives should not shun fellow captives if they break under extreme duress. They should be brought back into the fold. Take care of your fellow captives. The enemy wants dissension. When the interrogations begin again, as they normally will, do not start where you left off, but begin again from the beginning with renewed resistance. Article 6. I will never forget that I am an American fighting for freedom, responsible for my actions, and dedicated to the principles which made my country free. I will trust in my God and the United States of America. Do not forget that a member of the armed forces remains responsible for their personal actions at all times. When repatriated, POWs can expect their actions to be subject to review, both as to circumstances of capture and as to conduct during detention. The purpose of such review is to recognize meritorious performance and, if necessary, investigate any allegations of misconduct. Also know that it is U.S. policy, as stated by President Eisenhower at the signing of the Code of Conduct, that, in quote, no American prisoner of war will be forgotten by the United States. Every available means will be employed by our government to establish contact with, to support, and to obtain the release of all prisoners of war. Furthermore, the laws of the United States provide for the support and care of dependents of the armed forces, including those who become prisoners of war. I assure dependents of such prisoners that these laws will continue to provide for their welfare." End quote. A POW's service branch will continue to give dependents pay and allowances and benefits. Your country will continue to care for your family as it fights to secure your return home. Lastly, before being exposed to risk of capture, i.e., deployment, it is important that service members' personal affairs and family matters are taken care of. For example, your correct pay, powers of attorney, wills, debt payments, children's schooling, etc. The key to foreign detention during peacetime is to demand to speak to a U.S. representative in the country. While detained, don't embarrass the U.S. government and maintain your military bearing. The situations require diplomatic involvement as soon as possible. This is not a situation in which soldiers should attempt escape. For example, soldiers should not attempt to use physical means to escape for an arrest for a DUI in Germany. Governments are obligated to notify the detainee's consular officials. As American citizens, detainees should ask immediately and continually to see U.S. Embassy personnel or a representative of an allied or neutral government. Detainees are not likely to earn their release by cooperation. Release may be gained by the military member doing his or her best to resist exploitation, thereby reducing his or her value to a detainer, and thus prompting a hostile government to negotiate seriously with the U.S. government. It is essential that U.S. military personnel understand that the provisions of the Geneva Convention affording prisoner of war protections apply only during declared war or international armed conflict. U.S. military personnel detained by a hostile force during military operations other than war may be subject to the domestic criminal laws of the detaining nation. Detainees should attempt to maintain military bearing, if possible, and should avoid aggressive or combative behavior that would violate the criminal or civil laws of the subject country. Lastly, escape attempts from governmental detention are not recommended except under unique or life-threatening circumstances. Terrorist organizations are not signatories to the Geneva Conventions. Therefore, do not expect to be treated with POW status and protections. Regardless, continue to follow the guidance of the Code of Conduct to aid in you surviving with honor. Help your fellow captives. Do not help the enemy. Attempt escape if reasonable under the circumstances. Capture by terrorists is generally the least predictable and least structured form of captivity during operations other than war. In such terrorist captivity, hostages play a greater role in determining their own fate, since the terrorists, in many instances, do not expect or receive reward for providing good treatment or releasing victims unharmed. If U.S. military personnel are uncertain whether captors are genuine terrorists or surrogates of another government, they should assume that they are terrorists. During the initial stage, tension levels will be extremely high. The terrorists feel vulnerable at this point. Hostages should reduce this tension level by controlling their emotions, following instructions as far as practicable, and avoiding physical resistance. Sudden movement or action could precipitate a deadly response. However, to the extent possible, delay identification as a U.S. military or official traveler by claiming inability to locate documents or by other tactics. If directly confronted about your DoD status, lying is not recommended. The initial delay serves only to maximize survival during the initial stage. Surviving in some terrorist situations may depend on a hostage's ability to portray himself or herself as a person rather than an object, and by conveying personal dignity and apparent sincerity. Hostages may try the following techniques to convey their human qualities and build rapport. Techniques such as using their own names, not whining or begging as it may increase abuse, avoiding emotionally charged topics of religion, economics, and politics, avoiding being singled out by being argumentative or combative, avoiding escalating tensions with language such as gun, kill, punish, introducing commonalities such as family, clothes, sports, hygiene, food. Try active listening. Allow captors to discuss their cause or boast, but not to praise, pander, participate, or debate with them. Also, leaving fingerprints whenever and wherever possible is helpful in locating hostages. The hostage should not attempt to hide his or her face if photographs are taken. Photographs provide positive identification and information about the terrorists. Hostages should plan for being rescued. In case of rescue, the hostage should plan to reach the safest area, such as under desks, behind chairs, or any large object that provides protection. Avoid doors, windows, and open areas. When sounds or activities indicate an imminent rescue, the hostage should head for the safest area. If it cannot be reached, dropping to the floor with hands visible is appropriate. Hostages should not attempt to help rescue forces. Sudden movements could have deadly consequences. Instructions by the rescuers must be followed, and rough handling can be expected until authentication is accomplished. Only then should information about the terrorists and other hostages be relayed to the rescue party. If you have questions about the Code of Conduct, contact your servicing judge advocate. Finally, if you have any feedback on this presentation, please give it here. Thank you for your attention and service to our country. Now, go do great things.